Jason Walker stood in front of the grimy bathroom mirror at GrocerWay store number 247, barely recognizing the man staring back at him. Gone was the polished CEO who routinely appeared on magazine covers and spoke at shareholder meetings. In his place stood Jake Walker, a tired-looking stockroom trainee with messy brown hair, a pale green vest, and carefully applied makeup to dull the sharpness of his normally clean-cut appearance. The transformation had taken hours, complete with baggy clothes, old sneakers, and a new name tag. But what disturbed Jason most wasn't how different he looked. It was how distant he felt from the person he used to be. As he stared into the mirror, he whispered, "You're doing this for them," though even to himself the words felt half-hearted. The truth was, Jason hadn't stepped inside one of his company's grocery stores in nearly 5 years. After his father passed away, he had taken over GrocerWay's growing empire, now over 500 stores nationwide, and buried himself in board meetings, quarterly reports, and expansion strategies. But in the process, he'd lost touch with the people who actually made the company run: the cashiers, the janitors, the deli clerks, and stockroom workers who kept the lights on and the shelves full. It was during a tense family dinner that his younger sister Megan finally said what no one else would. "You've become a spreadsheet in a suit," she told him, "and you've forgotten everything Dad stood for." Her words had cut deep because they were true. Their father built GrocerWay from the ground up with one philosophy: take care of your employees, and they'll take care of your customers. Jason had brushed her off that night, but the guilt festered. Later that week, while reviewing internal reports, one store's name kept popping up. Store number 247. Its employee satisfaction scores had plummeted over the past year, and turnover was more than double the national average. On paper, the store met its sales targets, but something wasn't right. HR blamed the numbers on local economic trends, but Jason's instincts told him there was more to the story. Quietly, he reached out to his executive assistant, arranged for a transformation team, and crafted a plan. He would go undercover at store number 247, not as Jason Walker, the billionaire CEO, but as Jake, the newest member of the stockroom team. The plan was risky. No PR team had signed off on it. No board member even knew. But Jason needed to know the truth, not through filtered reports or curated field visits, but through lived experience. He needed to see what his employees endured on the ground, in the aisles and stockrooms behind the smiling customer service counters. It wasn't about making headlines or launching a dramatic exposé. It was personal. It was about restoring a connection. He had lost the connection between leadership and labor, between policy and people. Store number 247 was going to be his re-entry point into the world his father had once navigated with so much care. The moment he stepped out of the bathroom and into the back hallway of the store, the world hit him like a brick wall. The air smelled of cardboard bleach and day-old produce. Forklifts beeped in the distance, and voices echoed over the intercom. The floor beneath his feet was worn down from years of overuse, and the energy felt heavy, almost resigned. He wasn't greeted with a smile or a warm orientation. Instead, a gruff voice barked, "Break time's over. Get to the floor." It belonged to a broad-shouldered man with a sour expression and a name tag that read, Carl. Jason offered a meek nod and moved quickly, blending in as best he could. For the first time in years, no one looked at him as the boss. He was invisible, and that was exactly what he needed. As he adjusted to his new surroundings, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was wrong with store number 247. The employees moved quickly, but there was no joy, just quiet tension. The break room looked like it hadn't been cleaned in months. There were no staff photos, no motivational posters, no signs of community, just silence and stress. Over the course of that first shift, Jason noticed how the staff avoided eye contact with Carl, how laughter was rare, and how even small mistakes were met with harsh words. He realized that Megan had been right. He had become the kind of leader his father would have fired. But now, hidden in plain sight, he had a chance to change things. Not from the top floor, but from the floor where it mattered most. Jason's first encounter with Carl Jenkins came just 10 minutes into his shift. He had just wheeled a dolly of produce crates onto the sales floor when he heard the unmistakable sound of heavy boots behind him, each step landing with calculated weight. "You, Jake," the man barked already, halfway through a scowl. Jason turned, nodding. Carl Jenkins was every bit the stereotype of an old-school manager gone unchecked, mid-50s, tightly cropped hair, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, and a permanent scowl etched into his face like a badge of authority. His badge read, "Store Manager," but the energy he carried said, "Dictator." Without waiting for a reply, Carl jabbed a finger toward the dairy section. "You're late. Milk pallets are a mess. Get to it, and don't make me look for you again." Jason managed a quiet, "Yes, sir," and moved quickly, careful not to betray the fire of indignation already beginning to rise inside him. Over the course of the next few hours, Jason observed how Carl operated not through leadership, but through fear. His voice was sharp, often echoing across the aisles with public reprimands that humiliated more than corrected. When a teen cashier fumbled while bagging groceries, Carl swooped in and loudly questioned her competence in front of a line of waiting customers. When a janitor accidentally left a mop bucket in the hallway for too long, Carl kicked it over with a grunt and snarled something about basic responsibility. There was no coaching, no redirection, only barking orders and instilling fear. Jason had seen toxic leadership before, but never this blatant. What struck him most was not just Carl's aggression, but the silence it created. Employees didn't push back. They didn't raise concerns. They didn't even speak to each other unless necessary. The culture here was clear. Stay quiet, stay invisible, and you might survive the shift. During his break, Jason sat in the cramped, dimly lit break room, trying to blend in. The walls were stained. The vending machine was half broken, and an old microwave hummed weakly on the counter. He overheard two employees, one from deli, the other from customer service, whispering quietly in the corner. "Did you see what Carl did to Emily this morning?" one asked. "Yeah," the other replied. "Made her stay after closing last night, then put her on opening today. That's barely 6 hours between shifts." Jason's ears perked up. Emily. He had noticed her earlier, a young woman, probably late 20s, working the front register with a quiet poise. What he hadn't noticed was that she was pregnant. She's trying to hide it. One whispered, "But she's got to be 7 months by now. Still lifting crates like it's nothing." The other nodded. "She won't say anything. You remember what happened to Rachel last year? Got written up 3 times after she told HR. She was expecting Jason's stomach tightened." The quiet rumors were painting a much darker picture than anything he had seen in company reports. Back on the floor, Jason paid closer attention to Emily. Now that he was looking for it, the signs were obvious. She wore a vest 1 size too large. Her back arched slightly when she stood still, and she occasionally pressed a hand against her belly when no one was looking. But it wasn't just the physical signs, it was her demeanor. She was polite to every customer, never missed a beat. But behind the practiced smile was a deep, exhausted weariness. She didn't take her scheduled breaks. She stood for hours without resting. And when Jason gently offered to cover her register for 15 minutes so she could sit, she shook her head with a frightened smile. "I'm fine," she said, eyes darting toward Carl's office window. "I can't afford to slow down." Jason said nothing, but the anger inside him built steadily. The more he watched, the more Jason understood that this wasn't just an isolated case. The entire store operated under a cloud of intimidation, and Carl was the one holding the storm overhead. Employees flinched when he passed by. They whispered instead of speaking. Even senior team members, those who'd been there for years, walked on eggshells. It wasn't that they didn't care about the work. In fact, Jason was impressed by how much effort many of them still put in, despite the toxicity. But their energy was defensive, not proud. They were surviving, not thriving. And in Emily's case, the survival came at a physical cost. Jason realized with a sinking heart that HR's economic explanation for high turnover wasn't just wrong. It was a cover-up for something much worse. By the end of that shift, Jason had seen enough to know his instincts had been right. Store number 247 wasn't failing because of market conditions or supply chain delays. It was failing because of Carl, because of a culture of cruelty disguised as discipline, because somewhere along the way, people like Emily had stopped being seen as human beings and had become disposable cogs. As Jason walked to the back room to clock out, he passed by Emily's register one more time. She was still standing, her smile still intact, her hands scanning items with precision, but her shoulders sagged just a little more than they had that morning. And Jason knew this wasn't just about fixing a store. It was about fixing a system that had allowed this to become normal, and it started with her. The longer Jason stayed undercover, the more he realized how much of the store's truth lived in whispers, muted voices behind shelves, quick exchanges in supply rooms, fragments of stories passed like contraband. That's how he first heard about Emily's back-to-back shifts. It was during a lull in the afternoon rush when two teenage baggers were restocking plastic bags at the end of aisle 7. "She was here until almost midnight last night," one said, eyeing the front registers. "Then opened the store this morning. That's like 6 hours of rest tops." The other glanced nervously toward Carl's office. "And she's pregnant, man. You'd think someone would step in." Jason crouched nearby, pretending to arrange canned soup. Paused. He hadn't known the shift schedule, but it lined up with what he'd seen Emily arriving with tired eyes, rubbing her lower back between customers. She wasn't just overworked, she was being broken down shift by shift in plain sight. Once Jason began to look closely, he saw it everywhere, the quiet suffering masked by practiced professionalism. Emily's uniform was always clean, her name tag always in place, but her steps were slower than others, her breathing a little more shallow after each shift. She carried herself with precision, but there were tells how she'd subtly lean against the register counter when customers weren't looking, or how she'd discreetly wince when twisting to grab bags. Her belly, still modest under a loose vest, occasionally shifted beneath the fabric, and she'd instinctively rest a hand there, only to drop it quickly. If anyone approached, Jason noticed how she arranged her apron to hide the curve, how she avoided sitting even when she had a chance. He understood then Emily wasn't just pregnant, she was hiding it. Terrified of what might happen if the wrong person noticed, breaks were a formality on paper. In practice, they were almost non-existent. Jason watched as other cashiers took their 15-minute rests, grabbed snacks from the vending machine, checked their phones, but Emily. She never budged. Even when her shift log showed scheduled breaks, she stayed at her register, scanning items with robotic efficiency. When he gently asked her one afternoon if she wanted him to cover so she could sit for a few minutes, she smiled, genuinely but tiredly. "Thanks, Jake," she said, "but I'm okay. I've still got a rhythm going." He didn't push, but he saw her steal a glance at the office door, as if waiting for Carl to emerge and scold her just for thinking about resting. It was clear she was operating under fear, not routine. Jason remembered the HR reports that cited work-life balance preferences as a reason for high female turnover. Now he saw the truth. This wasn't about preference. This was about survival. Her resilience was astonishing. Day after day, Emily clocked in without complaint. She never raised her voice, never rolled her eyes at a difficult customer. Even when older patrons forgot items or took too long at checkout, she handled them with patience and grace. Jason could see it wore on her. Every scan, every smile, every fake cheerfulness chipped away at the foundation beneath, but she never cracked. At one point during a particularly busy evening, Jason saw her stumble slightly while reaching for a heavy bag of cat food. Her hand shot out to steady herself on the register. When he rushed over, concern etched on his face, she shook her head quickly. "I'm fine," she said, eyes pleading with him, not to make a scene, just a little off balance. It wasn't just about avoiding confrontation. She was protecting the only thing keeping her afloat, her job. That night, Jason stayed past his scheduled shift just to watch her finish hers. She rang up the last customer with the same exhausted smile, wiped down her station, and straightened a stack of weekly flyers before punching out. As she walked to the back room, her steps were slow, deliberate, each one placed like it cost something. Jason followed from a distance, noting how no one acknowledged her. No one asked how she was doing. It was as if her effort, her pain had become invisible. He realized that she had managed to disappear inside the role of model employee, and it was costing her more than anyone could see. He couldn't help but wonder how long she could keep it up. How long could a person push themselves to the brink without anyone stepping in? As he left the store that night, the parking lot already dark, Jason felt something shift inside him. He'd come into this assignment hoping to find operational issues, inefficiencies, weak links, maybe even a few procedural failures. Instead, he had found Emily, a woman trying to hold her world together in silence, a system that rewarded silence and punished vulnerability, and a store where people whispered truths because saying them out loud came with consequences. He stood by his car for a long time, watching her distant figure unlock a battered vehicle and disappear into the night. In that moment, he knew this wasn't just about fixing policy. This was about acknowledging pain that had been ignored for too long, and it had a name. Her name was Emily. It happened late in the afternoon, just before the evening rush, when the store lights began to flicker under the weight of too many customers and too few staff. Jason had been working near Register 4, breaking down a pile of flattened cardboard boxes when he caught sight of Emily swaying slightly at her station. Her fingers faltered for a split second on the scanner, the smile on her face flickering like the old bulbs overhead. She caught herself on the counter, her body stiffening to fight the sudden imbalance. In an instant, Jason dropped the box cutter and rushed forward, concern overriding caution. "Emily," he said gently, placing a hand near her elbow. "Are you okay?" She looked up at him, startled, her eyes wide, not with pain but with panic. "I'm fine," she said quickly. Too quickly. "Really?" "Jake, just a dizzy moment. It's nothing." But Jason wasn't convinced. He saw the faint tremble in her hands as she adjusted her apron, the way she bit the inside of her cheek to keep from saying more. Before he could press further, she lowered her voice, darting a glance toward Carl's office window. "Please," she whispered, "don't say anything. Don't tell anyone you saw that." Her tone was firm, almost desperate. Jason was taken aback. "Emily, you almost collapsed," he said quietly. "You should take a break. Maybe even go home for the day." But she shook her head. I can't give them any reason." Her hand moved to her belly almost reflexively. "If they find out, if it becomes official." Her voice trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air. She didn't have to finish the sentence, Jason understood. If GrocerWay's management had a reason, any reason, they would terminate her under the guise of performance issues. The revelation hit Jason like a punch to the chest. He had seen the statistics: higher turnover among women aged 25 to 35, unexplained drop-offs in tenure, but HR had always chalked it up to lifestyle shifts and natural attrition. Now, face to face with Emily's terror, he realized those explanations were just sanitized corporate spin. The truth was uglier. Pregnant employees weren't just unsupported, they were punished. Emily's pregnancy was not a condition to be accommodated, it was a liability to be eliminated, and she knew it. That's why she said nothing. That's why she smiled through pain and pushed through fatigue. That's why she feared kindness. It was too close to exposure. Jason felt shame rise in his throat. His company, the one his father built on principles of dignity and compassion, had become a place where motherhood was treated like a threat. From that moment on, Jason saw fear everywhere. It wasn't loud or dramatic, it was quiet, chilling. It was the way employees' shoulders stiffened when Carl walked by, the way they covered for one another in hushed tones, whispering warnings when Carl was in a bad mood. It was in the way no one ever asked for help, not even when they clearly needed it. They moved like shadows, efficient but joyless, each of them a silent hostage to a system that demanded everything and gave nothing in return. Jason couldn't believe how many small moments he had missed in his previous visits to stores, how many red flags he had waved away as store-level issues or management-style differences. But here, embedded in the daily lives of the people his decisions affected, there was no denying it anymore. Fear had become a management tool. That evening, while pretending to check inventory in the back room, Jason pulled out his phone and quietly opened the GrocerWay scheduling app. He found Emily's time card. She had been working 10-hour shifts with less than 8 hours between them. Her breaks were marked as taken, but he knew they weren't. It was all a paper trail designed to protect the store, not the worker. And worse, it was being tolerated, maybe even encouraged. Jason clenched his jaw. It was clear now. Carl wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom. And if employees like Emily had learned to keep their heads down and stay silent, it was because the cost of speaking up was too high. He had built a company that claimed to empower its people, but in reality had trained them to suffer quietly. When Jason clocked out that night, the cold air outside hit him harder than usual. He watched as Emily shuffled to her car across the far corner of the parking lot, her silhouette small beneath the weight she carried. He didn't call out. He didn't offer help. He knew she would decline again. Instead, he stood there, hands in his pockets, realizing just how deep the rot had gone. Emily's unspoken fear wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone in that store. And until someone at the top acknowledged it, it would continue to spread like a virus. Jason had come looking for inefficiencies, but what he found was something far more insidious. It was fear, and it had no place in the legacy his father left behind. Jason sat alone in the break room, a cold, half-eaten sandwich resting on the table in front of him. The space was poorly lit, the air stale with a faint chemical tang from old cleaning supplies. It was well past lunch, but the room was full. Employees taking staggered breaks, sitting in silence, sipping from vending machine sodas, or scrolling their phones with blank stares. He didn't speak at first. He listened. Nearby, two older employees, Janice from the deli and Marvin, a janitor in his 60s, leaned over a styrofoam container of fries, speaking in hushed voices that carried just enough for Jason to catch. "I heard Emily almost fainted yesterday." Janice whispered, her brow furrowed. Marta from produce had to grab her before she hit the floor. Marvin shook his head slowly, his fingers curled tightly around a paper coffee cup. Poor girl. When she first started, she used to bring homemade cookies for everyone. Always smiling, always laughing. He paused. Now she barely talks at all. Jason's hand froze over his sandwich as the conversation continued. "You remember Jessica from the bakery?" Janice asked Sweet Girl Fired 2 weeks after she told HR she was pregnant. "They said she was stealing ingredients, but come on, we all knew it was about the baby." Marvin nodded solemnly. "Same thing happened to Rachel last year. They called it performance issues. But funny how those only showed up after she submitted her doctor's note." Janice leaned in, her voice almost a whisper now. "That's the pattern. They make life miserable. Change your shifts, cut your hours, start a paper trail, and before you know it, you're out the door, clean and quiet." Jason felt his stomach turn. He had come into the store thinking Emily's situation was an isolated issue, a single failure in oversight. But now the full picture was coming into focus. This wasn't just one manager abusing his power. This was a system that quietly erased women who became inconvenient. He had always believed in GrocerWay's mission. He'd grown up idolizing the company. His father built the one that once threw baby showers for cashiers and celebrated employees' milestones like family. But something had changed. Somewhere along the company's rapid expansion, between the IPO, the franchise conversions, and the board-driven push for leaner operations, those values had been lost, or, worse, buried. Jason thought back to quarterly reports that listed attrition by demographic spreadsheets that showed spikes in departures among women aged 25 to 35. He'd asked about it once in a board meeting, and someone in HR had reassured him it was typical for the age group. But here on the floor, the truth couldn't be explained away by trends or turnover models. These were names, faces, lives. Emily was just the latest chapter in a long story of quiet disappearances. Later that evening, as the store began to wind down, Jason walked through the aisles with a clipboard in hand, pretending to do inventory checks. But his mind was elsewhere. Everywhere he turned, he saw the residue of the company's failure. A posted HR flyer about inclusion and respect peeling off the break room wall. An empty box labeled suggestion forms near the manager's office, locked with no pen in sight. An employee handbook on the bottom shelf of the storage closet gathering dust. It was all for show, window dressing. The real rules were unspoken, but clear. Don't complain. Don't get pregnant. Don't ask for help. If you want to stay employed, keep your head down and your mouth shut. Jason realized he had built a machine designed to optimize labor, and in doing so had forgotten the humanity inside it. That night, Jason couldn't sleep. He lay awake in his modest hotel room, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun in slow, hypnotic circles. The images from the day played on, repeat in his mind. Emily wobbling at her register, the quiet desperation in Janice's voice, the silence that followed every mention of HR. It struck him how calculated it all was. This wasn't accidental. It was engineered indifference built into policies that prioritized risk mitigation over compassion metrics over people. And the worst part, it had his name on it. His signature was on the very guidelines that allowed store managers to adjust employee hours just under the threshold for benefits. He had nodded along when legal teams warned against unnecessary accommodations. He had trusted that regional managers would do the right thing, never imagining how much was being hidden behind closed office doors. The next morning, Jason arrived at the store before sunrise. The parking lot was still empty, the sky a dull grey as the city began to stir. He sat in his car for a few minutes, watching the first employees trickle in, sipping burnt gas station coffee, unlocking doors, powering up registers. One of them was Emily. She moved slower than usual, one hand pressed to her lower back, the other gripping a tote bag. Jason didn't get out right away. He stayed in his seat, letting the engine idle, letting the weight of what he now knew settle into his chest. GrocerWay wasn't sick. It was infected with fear, with silence, with discrimination, and it wasn't going to change through another memo or employee appreciation day. No, this would take something deeper, something louder, something risky. As he finally stepped out of the car, Jason knew one thing for sure: the reckoning had to begin, and it would start with her. The night air was sharp and dry as Jason exited through the back door of GrocerWay store to 247, the buzz of fluorescent lights and distant intercoms still echoing in his ears. He didn't leave right away. Instead, he lingered in the shadowed edge of the loading dock, eyes scanning the parking lot. It was nearly 10:15 p.m., and most of the staff had already gone home, their cars peeling away one by one under the flickering lot lights. But Emily was still inside, likely finishing her closeout routine. Jason waited, arms folded, knowing she would be the last to leave. 10 minutes later, she emerged from the store's sliding doors, her green vest hanging loosely off one shoulder, her steps visibly slower than they had been that morning. She hugged a worn canvas bag to her chest, shivering slightly in the cold. Her thin jacket offered little protection. Jason stepped back further into the shadows, watching silently as she walked across the lot toward a weathered Honda Civic parked far from the entrance. She fumbled with her keys in the dim light, and as she opened the car door, Jason saw her suddenly double over one hand, clutching the top of the door frame, while the other pressed hard against her lower abdomen. His breath caught. He moved instinctively, but slowed before she could see him. After a few seconds, she straightened slowly, shakily, and slid into the driver's seat. He was about to step forward when her phone rang. Jason could see her through the windshield, lit by the soft blue glow of the dashboard as she answered. Her face, already drawn with fatigue, seemed to collapse further with every word she spoke. "Please," she said quietly, "I get paid Friday. I can send something then." Her voice cracked. "I know I'm behind. I've been sending partial payments when I can, but the ER visit, the insurance didn't cover enough." Jason could hear the tremble in her voice, even from this distance. "Yes," she whispered after a long pause. "I understand. Collections. Okay." The call ended, and silence took over the parking lot again, except now it was filled with the sound of muffled sobs. Jason took a step closer, watching as Emily leaned forward in her seat, forehead resting against the steering wheel, her shoulders shaking. She was cradling her belly with one hand, wiping her face with the other, her entire body folded in on itself. In that moment, Jason felt like an intruder on someone's most private agony, but he also felt something else, something deeper: rage, helplessness, and guilt. He had spent years trusting that the systems he built were working, but here was the truth, raw and unfiltered. A woman who had done everything right, worked hard, kept quiet, stayed late, being crushed under the weight of medical debt and fear. He stepped forward quietly, knocking gently on the window. Emily, startled, sitting upright quickly, wiping her face. "Hey," Jason said softly. "I didn't mean to scare you. I just saw you needed help." She tried to pull herself together, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's fine," she said, her voice brittle. "Just a long day. That's all." Jason crouched beside the car, not pressing. "Just being present. I noticed your car didn't start right away yesterday." He offered. "Need me to take a look?" Emily hesitated, pride and exhaustion warring behind her eyes. "It's the transmission," she finally admitted. "I'm still paying off the last repair. Can't afford a new one." She tried turning the key again. The engine groaned, sputtered, then fell silent. "It usually works after a few tries," she added quickly, as if she needed to prove something. Jason didn't say anything. He just stood, opened the hood, and peered inside. He already knew it wasn't a fixable issue. Not here. Not tonight. Behind him, he heard her phone buzz again. She answered, voice low and strained. "Yes, this is Emily Rivers. No, I'm not ignoring the bills. I've been trying to make payments. Please." Her voice cracked again. "I have a baby on the way. I'm doing everything I can." Jason turned his back to give her a sliver of privacy, pretending to inspect the engine as her pleas faded into silence. When she hung up, she didn't speak right away. She just sat there, arms crossed over her stomach, as if holding herself together. Jason finally stepped around to her side. "Let me give you a ride home," he said gently. "It's late, and you shouldn't be out here alone." Emily hesitated, still trying to hold on to some semblance of control. "I don't accept rides from strangers," she said. Jason smiled softly. "We work together, and it's either that or wait for a bus in this weather." After a long pause, she nodded. "Okay, just this once." The drive was quiet. Emily gave soft directions, leading Jason toward a rundown apartment complex on the outskirts of town. As they pulled into the cracked driveway, he noticed the peeling paint, the broken window panes, the for rent signs taped inside several units. This wasn't just about one bad day at work. This was about a life balanced on the edge of survival. Emily reached for the door handle, then stopped. "Why are you being so nice to me?" she asked, turning to face him. "People see someone like me, young, single, pregnant, and they assume I'm irresponsible, that I'm looking for handouts. I'm not. I just want to work and take care of my baby." Jason's throat tightened. "Is that why you're hiding the pregnancy from HR?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked like she might cry again. "Please," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Don't tell anyone. I only have 2 months left. I need every paycheck I can get." Jason nodded slowly. "Your secret's safe with me. But if you ever need help..." She cut him off gently. "I got myself into this. I'll get myself out." And with that, she stepped out of the car and disappeared into the building, leaving Jason staring after her, heart heavy, more determined than ever to fix what had gone so horribly wrong. Jason sat at the small desk in his hotel room long after midnight, the glow of his laptop screen casting harsh shadows across the walls. The worn-out chair creaked beneath him, but he barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the employee database he had accessed through his secure credentials. After what he'd seen in the parking lot, after the desperation in Emily's voice and the tremble in her hands, he needed to know the full story. He searched her name, Emily Rivers, and found her file buried beneath layers of HR reports and scheduling logs. What he uncovered made his blood run cold. 3 months ago, Emily had collapsed while on shift. It wasn't noted in the store's incident report log. Instead, there was a scanned copy of a document titled Voluntary Waiver of Medical Liability. Jason opened it. Her signature was there, shaky, barely legible. She'd been made to sign it to avoid implicating the company. According to the attached notes, she had driven herself to the emergency room afterward, incurring thousands in medical bills. That alone was enough to shake him. But what came next was worse. As Jason scrolled through Emily's scheduling history, he saw a distinct pattern. Before the collapse, she'd been averaging 36 hours a week, just shy of the threshold for full benefits. After the incident, her hours dropped, first to 30, then 28, and eventually hovering around 26, just low enough to avoid triggering eligibility for healthcare coverage. The entries were clean clinical notes, like schedule adjustment for operational needs or flex shift assignment approved. But Jason had seen enough scheduling manipulation in corporate life to know what this really was: a calculated effort to cut costs to keep her technically employed while stripping her of protections. In another document labeled Performance Tracking, there were vague remarks like slower movement observed and frequent fatigue reported by peers. Jason knew exactly what this meant. They were building a case, a paper trail, preparing to terminate her under the guise of poor performance. He leaned back in the chair, staring at the screen as a sick feeling pooled in his stomach. This was the machine he had helped build, a system that claimed to be about efficiency and accountability, but in truth had grown into a cold, bureaucratic predator. It didn't protect employees. It protected the company from employees. And now it was coming for Emily. She wasn't just a number in a spreadsheet. She was a young woman with a baby on the way, showing up every day, working through pain and fear. And in return, the company was orchestrating her downfall, step by step. Jason thought back to her voice in the car, barely a whisper. "I only have 2 months left." He now understood the urgency behind those words. She was hanging on by a thread, trying to outpace the clock, trying to hold on just long enough to get through the pregnancy without losing her job or her dignity. The deeper he dug, the more disturbing the story became. Buried in the digital records were echoes of others, like her pregnant workers, with sudden hour reductions, last-minute schedule changes, unexplained write-ups. The signs were all there if anyone had been willing to look, but Jason hadn't looked. Not until now. He had relied on the summaries from regional directors, trusted compliance dashboards, and sanitized HR reviews. And all the while, the company he led had quietly punished the most vulnerable. His father had warned him once years ago, "The numbers will always look good if you don't ask why." Jason had nodded back then, too green to fully understand. Now he saw it clearly. The numbers were hiding rot, and Emily's case was the match that might finally set it all ablaze. At sunrise, Jason returned to the store, his face harder than it had been since this undercover assignment began. Emily was already there, stationed at her register, her eyes dull from another sleepless night. Carl was pacing the floor nearby, barking orders. As usual, Jason watched from a distance as Carl made a beeline for her, waving a clipboard. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see Emily's shoulders tense. She nodded, obediently scribbled her initials, and returned to scanning items. Jason's fists clenched at his sides. He had the evidence. He had the truth. But now came the hardest part, figuring out how to act without jeopardizing her job further. Because if he stepped in too soon, she could be collateral damage. And if he waited too long, the company would do exactly what it had been designed to do: quietly remove her and leave no trace. That night, back at the hotel, Jason began collecting everything: screenshots, email logs, policy records. He compiled a full report detailing not just Emily's treatment, but a systemic pattern that mirrored it across multiple stores. He called his general counsel on a secure line and told them to stand by. He wasn't ready to reveal himself just yet, not until the picture was complete, but he knew now without a shred of doubt that GrocerWay had lost its way. And if he was going to fix it, he couldn't do it from behind a boardroom table. He had to do it right here in the trenches beside people like Emily, people who had been silenced, people who had been sacrificed for efficiency. And as he looked over his growing file of evidence, he knew this wasn't just a crisis. It was a reckoning, and it was long overdue. The following morning, Jason arrived at GrocerWay store Mer 247 with a new weight on his shoulders. After everything he had uncovered in Emily's records, every line of evidence that screamed systemic abuse, he expected to walk into another grim day, but nothing could have prepared him for what he witnessed next. As the store opened, Emily was already behind her register, quietly counting out her draw when Carl's voice sliced through the stillness like a blade. Rivers he called out loud enough for the two nearby cashiers and a couple of early customers to hear. "What's this? I hear about you getting a ride home from a co-worker." Emily stiffened, glancing up with alarm. "My car broke down," she said softly. It was freezing. He offered. Carl raised a hand to cut her off, theatrically shaking his head. "If you're too lazy to take the bus like everyone else, maybe this job's too much for you." The jab wasn't just cruel, it was strategic. Public, deliberate design to make her feel exposed. Jason stood frozen in the snack aisle, watching the humiliation unfold. Carl didn't stop there. "You want sympathy," he sneered now, speaking loud enough for even the deli counter workers to hear. "Maybe you should have thought about that before getting yourself knocked up." The words hit like a gut punch. Emily didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She just lowered her eyes and returned to her register. Her jaw clenched tight. Jason's fists curled so tightly he felt his nails dig into his palms. He wanted to lunge at Carl to rip off the disguise and end this farce, but he held himself back. Not yet. Not here. He needed more. More evidence. More accountability. He needed Carl to bury himself so deep that not even the most risk-averse corporate lawyer could protect him. Later that afternoon, as Jason restocked cans in aisle 9, Carl approached Emily near the stockroom with a handwritten task list. "Backroom needs organizing," he barked. "Pallets are backed up and we're getting a surprise inspection." Jason overheard her quietly reply. "I'm already scheduled at register for the evening." Carl scoffed. "Well, guess what? You're also on closing all week. And since you're not doing anything useful, you can start by lifting those crates of bottled water and moving them to the front display." Emily blinked in disbelief. "Sir, that's over £50 per case." Carl's smile was ice cold. "Pregnancy isn't a disability," he said sharply. "If you can't handle the job, maybe you shouldn't have one." She turned away before the tears could be seen, walking toward the back room with her shoulders stiff and her pace steady, but slower than before. Jason followed a few minutes later and found her struggling to move the first crate, her breathing shallow, one hand subconsciously resting on her stomach. "Let me help you," Jason said, stepping in front of her. "Please." She looked up, startled by the urgency in his voice. "Jake, you can't. If he sees—" "I don't care what he sees," Jason replied already. Lifting the crate, Emily leaned against the wall, catching her breath, and finally allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. "You want to know something funny?" she asked after a pause. "I used to think I could do this on my own." Jason placed the crate down gently and turned to her. She didn't wait for permission to continue. "When I found out I was pregnant, my fiancé Ryan, he said he needed time, said we were too young. Then one morning I woke up and he was gone. Left a note, took our savings, blocked my number." She let out a hollow laugh. "He moved to Seattle, got promoted. Probably has a new life now, while I'm here." Her voice didn't crack, but it was stretched thin, held together by years of swallowed pain. Jason listened without interrupting, knowing that sometimes silence offered more safety than words. Emily sat on an overturned crate, wiping sweat from her forehead. "This job. It's all I have. I've applied for assistance, but I make just enough to be disqualified. I've skipped meals just to keep my insurance active, and even that doesn't cover half the bills." She looked up at him, eyes sharp and resolute. "And now Carl is trying to push me out. I know it. The late shifts, the write-ups, the impossible tasks. It's like he's just waiting for me to quit so he doesn't have to fire me. Jason felt the slow burn of fury rise in his chest. He had seen management manipulation before, but never so ruthlessly targeted, never so calculated. And now, hearing Emily's story firsthand, it became more than just a data problem. It was personal. By the end of the shift, Emily was back at her register ringing up customers with the same tired smile she always wore. Jason stood a few aisles away, pretending to stock cereal, but every fiber of his being was focused on her. She looked like someone carrying the weight of an entire world and still refusing to let it crush her. He pulled out his phone, opened the voice recorder, and began documenting everything. Carl's comments, Emily's assignments, the list of violations and hostile actions, because now it wasn't just about saving one employee from a cruel manager. It was about dismantling an entire structure that allowed cruelty to thrive unchecked. And for that, Jason needed more than compassion. He needed undeniable proof, the kind that couldn't be ignored, the kind that would bring the entire broken system to its knees. Jason had reached a point of no return. The past few days had peeled away every illusion he once held about GrocerWay's internal operations. What had started as a covert investigation into low morale had turned into something far darker, a systemic rot hidden beneath layers of policy jargon and corporate detachment. Now, as he stood in the dim storage hallway just beyond the break room, phone discreetly clipped to the inside pocket of his vest, he knew the time had come to document the truth. Carl Jenkins had become too comfortable in his power, too confident that no one would challenge him. And Jason masked as Jake was going to use that overconfidence to capture the evidence that would finally take him down. He pressed record on the voice memo app and stepped into the storm. It didn't take long. That afternoon, Carl was already in a mood, something about a late delivery and a mystery shopper report that had flagged his store for poor employee friendliness. Jason, knowing the terrain, now casually wandered near the front of the store where Emily was once again bracing herself behind her register. Carl approached, shoulders puffed, clipboard in hand. "Rivers," he barked. "You didn't finish stocking the water pallets from yesterday." Emily's voice was steady but low. "I was on register all night and then had to clean the customer service area." Carl smirked. "Excuses don't move inventory. Maybe you're not cut out for this after all." Jason edged closer, pretending to tidy a display of granola bars, angling his chest toward the conversation. "Look," Carl continued, his voice dropping into something even colder. "If you want special treatment, go work somewhere soft. This is retail. It's not my fault you made poor life choices." Jason felt a spike of rage, but he kept his head down. He couldn't interfere. Not yet. He needed Carl to keep talking, and he did. Later that day, in the back office hallway, Jason found the opportunity he'd been waiting for. Carl was on the phone, loudly, carelessly, as Jason walked in with a stack of inventory forms. Carl waved him off, continuing his conversation with someone Jason guessed was another manager. "Yeah, I've got another one," Carl said, chuckling. "Rivers, you'd think they'd learned pregnant Moody and milking the system. I already cut her hours, just waiting for her to slip up again, and she's gone." He paused, then added, "Corporate doesn't care. As long as the numbers stay clean, you just have to build the file, make it look like she's failing on her own. Write-ups shift, changes over work. It's not rocket science." Jason's heart pounded. He had heard it all, every word recorded. That night, Jason reviewed the audio clips alone in his hotel room. He played them over and over again, listening not just to Carl's words, but to the underlying tone, the arrogance, the calculated cruelty, the certainty that the system would protect him. It wasn't just misconduct, it was weaponized authority endorsed by inaction. And now Jason had proof, undeniable, unfiltered, and impossible to explain away. He created a secure backup, emailed copies to his legal team under a disguised alias, and encrypted the originals onto a drive hidden inside the lining of his travel bag. This wasn't just for Emily anymore. It was for every employee who had been manipulated, pushed out, or punished for daring to need support. The next day, Jason continued the act. He showed up early, smiled through Carl's sarcasm, and completed mundane tasks without complaint. But behind every polite nod was a simmering fire. He recorded more interactions, Carl, denying Emily a scheduled break despite her obvious exhaustion, scoffing when she mentioned a doctor's appointment, and even mocking her in front of the deli staff. It was all there day by day. Jason compiled a library of evidence, each file another nail in the coffin of the toxic culture Carl had cultivated. And still, Carl remained oblivious. He thought he was untouchable. He had no idea the man sweeping behind the cereal aisle was the very person who held his future in the palm of his hand. By the end of the week, Jason had everything he needed: recordings, documents, schedules manipulated to skirt, benefit thresholds, testimonies overheard in break rooms. A full dossier of Carl's methods laid bare. But more importantly, he had something irrefutable: a recording of Carl openly admitting that pregnant employees were liabilities, expensive, difficult, and best dealt with quietly. That recording alone was enough to trigger legal investigations and ignite a firestorm at corporate. Jason knew what had to come next. It was time to drop the disguise, time to reveal who he was. But he would wait just one more day. He needed to make sure Emily was safe. He needed to confront Carl face to face, not just with power, but with proof. Because this wasn't just about justice, it was about reckoning. And for the first time since stepping foot into store, Nuffin 247, Jason felt the shift in momentum. The silence was ending. The truth was finally about to speak. It was just after 5 p.m. when the tension in GrocerWay store number 247 reached its breaking point. The aisles were buzzing with early evening shoppers, mothers juggling toddlers, elderly couples examining price tags, teens scanning shelves for snacks. Jason stood near the seasonal display restocking paper towels while keeping a watchful eye on Emily's register. Her face was pale. Paler than usual, her movements were slower, her breathing more labored. She hadn't taken a break in over 6 hours. And then it happened. As she scanned a bulky item, she suddenly faltered, her knees buckling beneath her. She tried to steady herself against the counter, but missed. Jason was already moving. He dashed forward and caught her just as her eyes rolled back, cradling her limp body in his arms before she could hit the floor. Gasps echoed around the store. A few customers rushed over. Others froze in stunned silence. "Call an ambulance," Jason shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. Try. Emily was barely conscious, her lips parted in a whisper. "The baby? Please. My baby." Her fingers curled around his shirt as he eased her down gently to the floor. Janet from the deli appeared at his side within seconds. "I'm trained in first aid," she said quickly, checking Emily's pulse. "We need to keep her still." Jason nodded, his heart pounding his eyes, scanning the crowd. And then, as if on cue, Carl Jenkins emerged from the office, clearly annoyed at the disruption. He marched toward them with the same authority he'd always wielded, his voice as cruel as ever. "What the hell is going on here? This isn't a hospital." Jason stood up slowly, fury simmering just beneath the surface. "She collapsed," he said evenly. "She needs medical attention." Carl rolled his eyes. "She's probably faking it. You know how these girls get always looking for attention." The words hung in the air like poison. Jason's blood ran hot, but he didn't respond. Not yet. He knelt back beside Emily, whispering words of comfort until the sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension. The paramedics arrived quickly, wheeling in a stretcher. As they assessed Emily's condition and prepared her for transport, Jason stood turning slowly toward Carl. His decision had already been made. No more waiting, no more pretending. He reached up and peeled off the fake beard he'd worn every day for the past week. The glue pulled slightly at his skin, but the rush of liberation made him feel weightless. As Carl watched confused, Jason reached into his vest pocket and pulled out his GrocerWay corporate ID badge, flipping it open for the world to see. "I'm Jason Walker," he said loudly, his voice carrying across the store. "CEO of GrocerWay." The silence that followed was deafening. Employees stopped what they were doing. Customers stood motionless. Carl's face drained of color. "That's impossible," he stammered. "You're just a stock boy," Jason interrupted. "I've spent the last week working alongside the people you've been abusing. Listening, watching, recording. And what I've seen here is beyond unacceptable. It's cruel. It's illegal." He stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You targeted pregnant employees, cut their hours to avoid benefits, and manipulated records to build false performance cases. And today, one of them nearly lost her life because you denied her a basic human right." "Rest," Carl tried to recover, blustering. "You can't talk to me like this. I've run this store for 5 years. And as of right now," Jason said, his tone like ice, "you're done, you're fired. Effective immediately." There were murmurs across the store, a few employees visibly shocked, others wide-eyed with quiet relief. Carl looked around as if searching for an ally, but found none. "You can't fire me without due process," he shouted. "I'll sue you for slander for wrongful termination." Jason pulled out his phone and played back one of the recordings. Carl's voice rang out loud and clear. "Pregnant women. Just push 'em out before they become a problem. Cuts costs." The store went silent again. Jason lowered the phone. "That was you. On company property. Speaking to another manager, I have hours of audio just like it. And when HR hears it, when legal hears it..." He stepped closer. "You won't be suing anyone. You'll be lucky if you're not charged." Carl opened his mouth but said nothing. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed toward the office. Shoulders hunched, the weight of his downfall finally catching up to him. As the paramedics lifted Emily onto the stretcher, Jason rushed back to her side. She looked up at him, her eyes glassy with confusion and pain. "Eli," she murmured, still using the name he'd given her. "What's happening?" Jason leaned close and gently squeezed her hand. "We'll talk later," he said softly. "Right now, you need to focus on you and your baby. You're safe now, Emily. I promise." She nodded weakly, her grip tightening around his fingers. As they wheeled her out through the automatic doors, Jason turned to the employees gathered nearby. "What happened here today ends now," he said firmly. "We're going to fix this store. We're going to fix this company. And it starts with standing up for the people who make it run." He watched the ambulance disappear into the evening light, a knot forming in his chest, not of fear, but of resolve. The confrontation was over, but the real work was just beginning. The inside of the ambulance was dimly lit, its fluorescent lights casting pale shadows over Emily's face as she lay strapped to the stretcher, her breathing shallow, her eyes fluttering open only for brief moments. Jason sat across from her legs, braced against the movement of the speeding vehicle, watching every rise and fall of her chest with tense focus. One of the paramedics was monitoring her vitals while quietly radioing the hospital. The other adjusted an oxygen mask over Emily's face, checking her pulse with gentle efficiency. Jason leaned in close, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't worry about anything," he said. "Your hospital bills, whatever they are, they're covered. Every penny. You just focus on staying strong for you and the baby." Emily stirred slightly, blinking up at him. "You don't have to..." she began, her voice hoarse. "Yes, I do." Jason cut in a rare firmness in his tone, "because you never should have had to carry this alone." As the ambulance weaved through traffic, Jason pulled out his phone and began making calls. First to his executive assistant, cancelling every meeting for the next 7 days. Then to the heads of HR and legal. "I need a full emergency meeting at headquarters in 2 hours, he said into the phone. "And I don't want excuses. I don't care what time it is. We're not waiting until Monday. Get everyone on the line. This is no longer a store-level issue." His voice, once known for measured calm, now crackled with a sharp urgency. He followed up with another call to the regional director overseeing store Shrubber 247, demanding an audit of every disciplinary file under Carl Jenkins' leadership. No filters. Jason said, "I want raw data. If there's anything that looks even remotely retaliatory or discriminatory, I want it flagged and sent to my personal inbox." The paramedic glanced at him briefly, recognizing perhaps that this wasn't just any man sitting beside a patient. This was someone who had the authority and now the will to burn the system down if needed. When they arrived at the hospital, Emily was immediately rushed into a monitored room for evaluation. Jason remained by her side until the nurse gently asked him to wait in the hallway. Pacing the sterile corridor, he felt the weight of responsibility in a way he never had before, not just for her, but for everyone who had trusted GrocerWay to be more than a paycheck. In his inbox, emails began to flood in compliance summaries, policy documents, scanned copies of past employee complaints, all previously buried under resolved tags or insufficient evidence notations. But now he could see the pattern: dozens of women in similar positions to Emily, quiet removals, manipulated schedules, punitive write-ups. What Carl had done wasn't rare. It was just the most extreme version of what had become normalized. And Emily, through her pain and perseverance, had made the invisible visible. By the time Jason sat down with the hospital's billing administrator, his resolve had crystallized. Whatever she needs, emergency treatment, prenatal care, recovery support, it's all covered, full access, no limits, and I want it underwritten, personally, if necessary. The woman blinked, caught off guard. "May I ask who you are?" Jason offered a small, tight smile. "I'm the reason she's in this position, and I'm going to be the reason she gets out of it." After signing a flurry of authorization forms, he stepped outside into the parking lot, dialed into the now assembled emergency conference call with GrocerWay's senior leadership faces, filled the screen, some confused, some panicked, others clearly trying to gauge which way the wind was blowing. Jason didn't waste time. "You're all aware of what happened at store 247. I've been undercover there for the past week. What I witnessed is unacceptable, and it's going to stop starting tonight." He walked them through everything: his findings, the recordings, the manipulated schedules, the intimidation, the discrimination. But then he shifted gears. "This isn't just about Carl," Jason said. "He's not the disease. He's a symptom. We created a culture where cruelty was efficient, where loyalty was exploited, where silence was rewarded. That ends now." The room was still. A few executives averted their eyes. One quietly signed out of the call, likely preparing their resignation. Jason continued. "Emily Rivers is in the hospital because we failed her, because we allowed numbers to matter more than people. But she's also the reason this company is about to change. She didn't ask for a spotlight, but she earned it. And moving forward, we will build every reform in her name." As he ended the call and stepped back inside to check on Emily, Jason felt a strange stillness settle over him, not of peace, but of clarity. For too long he had relied on policies, procedures, and polished statements to define leadership. But none of that had saved Emily. What had saved her, at least in time, was the act of finally seeing her, hearing her, and stepping in. The moment she collapsed wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a reckoning, a rupture in the carefully controlled image GrocerWay had projected for years. Now that image was gone. In its place was a face, Emily's, softened by pain, hardened by resilience, and unforgettably human. And as Jason stood at her bedside once more, watching her rest under the soft hum of hospital monitors, he knew this. She wasn't just the reason for change, she was the beginning of it. The boardroom at GrocerWay's national headquarters had never felt so tense. Long, polished mahogany tables stretched beneath rows of high-backed leather chairs filled with division heads, senior executives and department directors, many of whom had never set foot in a grocery store's backroom. They came dressed in tailored suits, armed with data points, and prepared for another quarterly strategy session. But this wasn't a strategy meeting. This was a reckoning. Jason Walker stood at the head of the table, no longer in disguise, no longer cloaked in polite corporate ambiguity. He was still wearing his GrocerWay vest, the same one he'd worn when Emily collapsed into his arms. Behind him, a large screen displayed the company's internal compliance dashboard, only this time it had been reworked, stripped of corporate spin and filtered narratives. What remained were raw numbers and red flags. "Before we begin," Jason said, his voice sharp but steady, I want to remind you that this company was built to serve people, not to survive off their silence. He tapped the remote. The first slide showed the turnover rate of women aged 25 to 35 across GrocerWay locations, 3 times higher than any other demographic. Another tap revealed a heat map of stores where pregnant employees had left within 6 months of disclosing their condition. Then came the audio. A voice filled the room. Carl Jenkins bragging about pushing out problem pregnancies to avoid extra costs. Several executives flinched. Jason let the silence linger. This isn't a one-store problem. He said, this is a culture problem, one that we've created through willful blindness, performance-driven policies, and cowardice disguised as efficiency. Marcus, the head of HR, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Jason, I understand your concern. Jason cut in. Emily Rivers is in a hospital bed because our concern came too late. He paused, and she's not the only one. Jason laid out the reforms with precision. Effective immediately, all part-time employees working over 20 hours per week would receive full health benefits, including maternity care. Pregnant employees would be given legally compliant and morally necessary accommodations without delay or pushback. A zero-tolerance policy for harassment and discrimination would be instituted not just on paper, but with teeth. Any manager caught retaliating or manipulating hours to avoid benefits would be terminated immediately regardless of tenure. Additionally, all employee complaints past and present would undergo an independent audit. We're not hiding this, Jason added. We're going public, and we're going to own our failures before someone else exposes them. No one in the room dared to object. Now the tone had shifted from debate to acceptance. GrocerWay wasn't being asked to change, it was being told to. Then came the final slide, a photo of 2 women. One was Janet Brooks, a long-time deli worker from store number 247, who had provided first aid to Emily in her moment of crisis. The other was Sarah Fields, a former cashier from store number 156, who had quietly been pushed out after requesting lighter duties during her second trimester. These women understand our failures better than anyone, Jason said, which is why I'm promoting them to senior roles in our HR division. Janet Brooks will become our Vice President of Employee Relations. Sarah Fields will take over as Director of Workplace Equity. There was a pause, followed by a few murmurs of surprise. Victoria, the CFO, looked visibly skeptical. Jason, with all due respect, neither of them has executive experience. Jason didn't flinch. They have lived experience. And right now, that's what we need more than anything. As the meeting drew to a close, Jason stood silently at the head of the table, allowing the magnitude of the moment to settle over the room. This wasn't just about new policies. It was about a new philosophy, one where empathy was as important as efficiency, where dignity held equal weight to data. Several executives lingered after the meeting, some to quietly express support, others to ask how they could help move the reforms forward. A few slipped out wordlessly, already updating their resumes. But Jason didn't care about the politics. He cared about the people. People like Emily, who had been left behind by a system designed to extract, not protect people like Janet and Sarah, who had every reason to walk away, but chose to stay and rebuild instead. Later that evening, as Jason walked the empty halls of corporate headquarters, he paused outside the HR department, the very place where so many cries for help had been buried under bureaucracy. Tomorrow, Janet and Sarah would be taking over those offices, and for the first time in a long time, Jason believed change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable, because now the company had faces to its failures, names to its numbers, and a story too powerful to ignore. He looked down at the GrocerWay logo on his vest, fingers brushing over the stitched patch. It used to be a brand he wore with pride. Now it was a reminder of responsibility, and from this day forward that responsibility would no longer be avoided. It would be lived store by store, policy by policy, life by life. 3 months after the day, she collapsed on the floor of GrocerWay store 247. Emily Rivers returned not as a cashier, but as a symbol of what had changed. She walked through the automatic doors on a crisp spring morning. sunlight spilling across the newly installed welcome mat that read, "Where people come first." In her arms was baby Grace, nestled inside a soft sling, pressed against her chest, peacefully asleep. Emily looked different now, not just in posture, but in spirit. The fear that once lived in her eyes had been replaced with quiet confidence. Her steps were steady, her smile genuine. Staff who had once spoken only in whispers now greeted her warmly, and at the center of it all, behind her new badge and title, was a purpose she never could have imagined. Employee Wellness Coordinator. It wasn't just a job, it was her mission. Jason met her near the front office, dressed in business casual instead of a suit, his sleeves rolled and his demeanor relaxed. They shook hands, then hugged briefly, no longer bound by the barrier of role or hierarchy. "You look strong," Jason said, nodding toward Grace. "She's beautiful," Emily beamed. "She sleeps like she knows she's safe now," she replied. That moment, simple yet profound, marked the rebirth, not just of one woman's journey, but of an entire company's soul, under Jason's leadership. GrocerWay had launched a comprehensive national wellness initiative, one that placed dignity care and balance at the core of its operations. Every store now had a trained employee wellness coordinator. Medical leave protocols had been rewritten. Maternity and paternity benefits were not just extended, they were celebrated. New mothers and fathers across the country found themselves receiving support they never thought possible in retail. Break rooms had been redesigned with lactation spaces and childcare planning resources. A new hotline was created, staffed not by a call center, but by real HR professionals trained in empathy and resolution. Emily, in her new role, helped craft workshops on mental health, awareness, parental planning, and workplace flexibility. "It's not about making things easier," she said during her first national Zoom training. "It's about making things human." The old days of performance reviews driven solely by numbers were gone. Now employee satisfaction surveys were taken seriously. Managers were trained not just on leadership, but on compassion. Carl Jenkins' name was no longer spoken aloud, but his legacy remained as a warning of what happens when profits are pursued without purpose. The results came quickly. Within 2 months of rolling out the wellness reforms, employee turnover had dropped by nearly 40%. Stores once plagued by revolving door staffing began seeing employees stay longer, even recommending friends and family to join the company. Customer satisfaction scores began to rise, driven not by faster checkout speeds, but by the warmth and patience of employees who felt seen and supported. At store number 247, shoppers began to notice the difference. Smiles were no longer forced. Conversations happened. One elderly customer even left a handwritten note near the customer service counter. "You can feel the kindness here now." That note was framed and hung beside the new employee break room bulletin board, a space once filled with outdated flyers, now brimming with photos of babies born, birthdays celebrated, and dreams revived. Emily's office, once a neglected storage closet, had become a sanctuary. Plants lined the windowsill. A cushioned corner chair welcomed employees looking for a break or a private conversation. And on the wall hung a single photograph, Emily holding Grace on the day she returned, flanked by Jason and Janet Brooks, the new VP of Employee Relations. "Every person who walks in here matters," Emily had written underneath the photo, "and every story deserves to be heard." That mantra became the heartbeat of GrocerWay's new culture. Former skeptics had come around, not because they were forced, but because they finally understood the value of building from the inside out. A culture of trust, safety, and shared humanity had emerged not from a press release, but from a moment of collapse witnessed and honored. Jason often walked the aisles of his stores quietly, now sometimes in plain clothes, sometimes in his old vest. He liked seeing the work not from behind a desk, but from the ground, where it had always mattered most. One day, while visiting a store in Ohio, he passed by a young cashier laughing with a mother and her toddler. The laughter wasn't staged, it was real, that to him was the clearest metric of success. As he stepped outside, he pulled out his phone and glanced at the latest company report: lowest quarterly turnover in 5 years, highest employee retention rate in company history. But those weren't the numbers that mattered most to him anymore. What mattered was knowing that somewhere across the country, another Emily might walk into work tomorrow carrying a burden too heavy to see, and that this time someone would be there to carry it with her. The sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon when Jason Walker stood alone outside GrocerWay store Library 1, the very first location his father had opened nearly 4 decades ago. The weathered brick facade looked much the same as it did in the photos that lined his childhood home, but everything else had changed. Inside the store now operated with a new spirit: break rooms filled with light and laughter, wellness posters featuring real employees, and a bulletin board showcasing baby announcements, personal milestones, and handwritten thank you notes from customers. Jason reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a faded photograph, his father in an apron standing in front of the original store with an arm around a smiling cashier. "Take care of your people, and they'll take care of everything else," his father used to say. That was the foundation GrocerWay had been built on. Somewhere along the way, Jason had lost sight of it. But now, brick by brick, trust by trust, he was building it back. The transformation didn't come from shareholder mandates or high-level board directives. It came from the floor, from listening, from witnessing, and from one quiet, resilient cashier who refused to break. Emily had become a symbol of the company's reawakening, but she had never asked for that role. She had simply shown up every day doing the best she could under impossible pressure. Now she stood proudly in her new position, baby Grace by her side, mentoring young employees and shaping policies that honored not just profit, but people. One afternoon she received a letter in the mail. It was from Ryan, her ex-fiancé. He'd seen the viral news coverage, read the article about her recovery and promotion, and wanted to talk. "Maybe we can start fresh," he wrote. Emily folded the letter, slowly smiled, and placed it in the bottom drawer of her desk without replying. She wasn't angry. She was simply no longer looking back. Her future had already begun. Jason learned about the letter a few days later when he visited Emily's office to deliver a copy of the finalized GrocerWay Wellness Charter signed into company policy that morning. She told him the story with a small, almost amused smile, and he nodded in quiet understanding. Sometimes, Jason said, the best revenge is becoming exactly the kind of person you needed back then. Emily chuckled, adjusting Grace's blanket in her carrier. "I don't want revenge," she replied. "I just want to give people something better than what I had." It struck Jason how her perspective, rooted in grace, not bitterness, was exactly what had been missing from corporate leadership for years. And it wasn't just GrocerWay that was noticing. Word of the transformation had begun to spread across the industry. CEOs from rival chains had started reaching out, curious about what had shifted, asking for access to the training modules and policy frameworks Jason's team had developed. At the annual National Retail Leadership Summit, Jason took the stage to deliver the keynote address. It was the first time GrocerWay had been invited to speak in years. Once seen as an efficient but cold empire, now hailed as an example of human-centered reform. Instead of charts and forecasts, Jason shared Emily's story. He spoke of walking the aisles undercover, of watching fear etched into the faces of his employees, and of the day that fear collapsed literally into his arms. He didn't sugarcoat the company's failures. He owned them. And then he laid out the path forward, leading with empathy, investing in dignity, and remembering that policies aren't worth the paper they're printed on if they don't protect people. The crowd rose to their feet when he ended with a single quote printed across the screen behind him. "We stopped asking what it costs to care and started asking what it costs not to." Back at GrocerWay headquarters, the walls that once showcased sales leaderboards and quarterly KPIs now displayed something else: stories. Real stories, photos of employees who had overcome challenges, testimonies from team members who were thriving because someone finally listened. In one corner of the new employee relations wing hung a framed copy of the very first letter Jason wrote to the board demanding reform. Beneath it, in a small engraved plaque, were the words, "In honor of those who stayed silent because they thought no one would care. We hear you now. For Jason, it wasn't just a slogan, it was a vow to never again let bureaucracy overshadow humanity, a vow to lead the way. His father once did shoulder to shoulder, not from above, and so a legacy that had once seemed diluted by expansion and buried under metrics found new life. GrocerWay became not just a place to shop or work, but a place to belong. Emily's daughter Grace toddled through store aisles as employees grinned and waved, calling her our little miracle. Emily, now a sought-after speaker on workplace equity, continued to mentor young women balancing motherhood and career. Jason, no longer defined by quarterly earnings alone, led with the quiet conviction of a man who had made mistakes and learned from them. Their story of collapse and courage of silence and speaking up rippled outward. Other companies followed suit. New legislation referenced GrocerWay's model, and somewhere out there in stores yet to be built, a new generation of workers would walk into their first shift, knowing one simple truth: they mattered. Because once one woman refused to stay invisible, and one leader finally chose to see. If this story moved you, we invite you to be part of the conversation. At Deep Inside HQ, we bring real stories that remind us what leadership, empathy, and courage look like in the moments that matter most. Subscribe for more powerful narratives that pull back the curtain on workplaces, challenge systems, and celebrate those who dare to make a difference. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps shape a better future. And if this story inspired you, pass it on. Sometimes all it takes is one story to start a revolution.